I want to thank everybody for being here. I think we're going to be talking about something today that's pretty near and dear to all of our hearts. We know that the Communist China has decided to be our adversary, and so we've got to figure out how we do this. So we've come here today to come up with ideas how we can combat the threat the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States, to democracy and the global order, specifically to our national security and defense, to international commerce and finance, and to, as many of us know, unfortunately some of us know very personally, human rights. For the past 3 years I've been in the U.S. Senate, I've been warning my colleagues that Communist China has chosen, they've chosen to be our enemy, and that we have entered into a new Cold War with Beijing. I think it's past time for us to realize that Communist China does not want to join the community of nations so much as it wants to rule over the global community. We need to see that Secretary General Xi is trying to reshape the global order into the image he wants, one where Communist China is the dominating superpower. He believes in a sum-zero game, where everyone else must lose for him and Communist China to come out on top. We can see that in his quest for territorial expansion, the creation of hypersonic weapons, his willingness to engage in cyber attacks on foreign countries, including us, and his practice of sending spies to our country to steal sensitive research and trade secrets. Similarly, we see it in his tactical, if not strategic, commitment to support Vladimir Putin even before Russia invaded Ukraine, which is disgusting. And now that Russian troops are in Ukraine and upending our rules-based international order, Xi is tactically, if not blatantly, supporting Putin. They are two peas in the pod, even with their economic and technological dissimilarities. We also see sum-zero vision in Beijing's willingness to invade international trade laws, infringe on American intellectual property, manipulate currency, shield its publicly traded companies from transparent accounting, and walk back its international commitments like the Phase 1 trade deal. Finally, this zero-sum game is evident in Xi's willingness to imprison political dissidents, destroy democracy in Hong Kong, and engage in systematic genocide of the Uyghur people in decades-long persecution against Christians, Tibetans, and members of Falun Gong. The list of Communist China's abuses and crimes is long as the Great Wall. And while we're only going to be able here to scratch the surface of the regime's wrongdoing, I think we're in for a very productive conversation. We're here because of your valuable knowledge and experience within these three major areas where we can see Beijing's adversarial nature most clearly. When there's such a clear and present danger to our nation's security, our economy, and to liberty and human rights, we all have to work together. Everyone here comes from a different background. We have different experiences, but we're all here because we agree that we have to start standing up to Communist China. When enemies stand before us, we need a team. Everyone has to do their part, and we're all doing our part. If we all do our part, we'll be able to withstand their attacks. So I hope today that we're able to come up with some real suggestions of what we can be doing to protect American families and the global order from abuses coming out of Beijing and help the people of Communist China. On my end, I've been proud to work with many of my colleagues to introduce and work on multiple pieces of legislation to confront Communist China. In the area of trade and finance, I've introduced the IMF Accountability Act to prevent the International Monetary Fund from allocating special drawing rights or providing increased lending to Communist China and other adversaries. It's hard to believe we do this. We give them money. I've also worked with Senator Cotton to introduce the China Trade Relations Act to strip Communist China of its permanent and normal trade relations status. I've worked with Senator Kennedy to pass the Holding Foreign Companies Accountability Act to hold Chinese firms accountable for their lack of transparency in accounting while listed on our stock markets. Regarding human rights, for the previous 2 years, I led the charge against the International Olympic Committee to move the 2022 Olympics out of Beijing into a country that actually respects human rights, because they clearly don't. Of course, I'm also very proud to work with Senator Rubio to get the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act across the finish line to ensure that Americans and American companies are not financing the disgusting genocide in the Uyghur homeland. In our national security, I've introduced the American Security Drone Act to keep Chinese-made drones out of federal agencies. I've also introduced 2 bills on Taiwan, the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, which would end our policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, and a bill to end all financial transactions with Communist China if they invade Taiwan. Beijing needs to understand that Congress is serious about the threat it poses. That's why we're here today. We're all serious about standing up for America and coming up with ways to help the Chinese Communist Party hold them accountable. For a few ground rules, we're going to start by going around the table. We'll start with Ambassador Curry, and we'll conclude with Jacob Helberg. If you'll please just introduce yourself and give an idea what you've been doing, what you'd like to speak about. Then we'll kick it off with, I'll kick it off with some questions, but we'll just open it up so everybody can talk. So, Ambassador Curry.
Thank you, Senator Scott. It's an honor to be here with you today and with so many colleagues who I've worked with over the years on so many of these issues. And listening to you go through the list of things, the actions that have been taken recently to push back on China's malign influence here in the United States and around the world, it is very heartening to me as someone who's worked on human rights for nearly 3 decades here in Washington and has seen China at the center of nearly every human rights problem that I've worked on around the world or connected to it in some way. And to see that we're finally waking up to the true nature of the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States and to human rights and democracy around the world is something that I've waited for and worked for a really long time. But I think we all know that the first step to solving a problem is admitting that you have a problem, and I think we finally admitted that we have a problem, and we're starting to take some of the hard and painful but necessary steps to actually solve that problem. I've worked, as I said, mostly on human rights for the past few years, and including in the previous administration, where I was very fortunate to serve as part of the team that worked on the Uyghur genocide determination and helped to push that across the finish line before we left office. And I was very proud of the work that we did. In particular, I worked very closely with Nazak on things at the Commerce Department on the entities list and the number of companies that we put on the entities list and the withhold release orders that we had the Customs and Border Protection agencies putting in place to keep Uyghur forced labor products out of our supply chain. But the work that Congress has done on this has been absolutely essential. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed last year and signed by the President is a landmark piece of legislation. It should not have taken as long as it did to pass. We all know why it took so long, and that was appalling, especially once the Biden administration came in and determined and agreed with the determination that genocide and crimes against humanity were taking place in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic and religious minorities. That they continue to block that legislation is appalling, but it shows that we're not there yet, that even as with all the progress that we've made in recognizing the threat, we still have a long way to go. I think that we're also seeing that, and I think we're getting close to this tipping point where we're seeing the immorality in a way of the way that we have put ourselves at the mercy of the Chinese business model in our own country. And I look at things like how there are trillions of dollars in assets under management in what are called ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance funds, that are supposed to be clean investments and virtuous investments. But out of those, billions and billions of them are invested in China as well. And this doesn't seem to trigger any kind of review by the fund managers who are saying, oh, these are virtuous investments. So this is what I've been working on, is this intersection between finance and human rights and how we can hold these fund managers who are investing our money. They're not even investing their own money, right? They're investing our retirement savings, our pension funds, and using our capital markets to prop up the Chinese Communist Party and allow it to carry out the activities that it's carrying out that threaten our national security, that threaten our economic security, and that threaten our way of life, and threaten the international human rights principles that are really derived and very, very much analogous to our founding principles of this country. And that everything that they are trying to do, whether it's the genocide against the Uyghurs, the destruction of Hong Kong as a free space under Chinese rule, the treatment of the Tibetans, the treatment of other religious minorities, all of these things derive from their ideology, which is opposed to allowing people to think freely, act freely, worship freely. And this is who we are as a people. We can't contribute to this, but we have been sending trillions of dollars to support this system, and we need to really take all the steps that we can. We need to keep our economy open and use the tools that we have that allow us to thrive as a society, but that can't mean that we continue to subsidize the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm looking within market principles and trying to figure out how we do this, how we have people look at autocracy as a risk, how we have them look at human rights abuses as part of their risk management and risk analysis. And so that you see with what's happening with all the divestment with Russia, that people are paying a price for not taking that risk seriously in investment. And so starting to really try to drill down on how we can do this in a way that respects our market economy, but also allows us to really incorporate those risks into our investments. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague. Enes.
First of all, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. You know, my experiences were a little different than everyone else. I remember the last, yes, that's better. I remember the last, 10 years, I was, focusing on only the human rights abuses are happening in my home country, Turkey, and obviously, that's my home country, and my family was there. But then this past, summer, I started to, just study about what's happening over there in China, and the more I read and the more I learned and educated myself, I was very frustrated and ashamed with myself. And I was like, I cannot believe the last 10 years I was only focusing on one dictatorship, and it was Turkey. So I promised myself, I'm like, whatever it takes, I'm just gonna go out there and do whatever I can to just bring awareness about what's going on. And I remember I was doing a basketball camp, and I remember I was taking a picture with the kids, and one of the parents called me out in front of everybody and said, how can you call yourself a human rights activist when your Muslim brothers and sisters are getting tortured and raped every day in concentration camps in China? I was shocked. I couldn't say anything. I just turned around and said, I promise you I'm gonna get back to you. So, and then like I said, I started to study, and I was very frustrated with myself, and I was like, whatever it takes, I'm just gonna go out there and just try to, bring awareness. And obviously, whenever you talk about a country like China, some people was gonna get really uncomfortable. And I remember I was getting lots of warning from the NBA and even from my teammates, and they're saying, listen, I think what you're doing is so amazing, especially my teammates, what you're doing is so amazing, but there's gonna be big consequences. Because, just past year, the more people watched NBA game in China than American population. So, once, there's lots of money and business involved, obviously people are gonna get really uncomfortable. And I started to, when I talked about the problems that are happening in Turkey in the last 10 years, I did not get one phone call. But I started to talk about the problems that are happening in China. My phone was ringing once every hour. They were calling me from the NBA and Player Association and saying, listen, this is going to, bring a lot of impact, but just be careful. This is going to, even like when I had a conversation with my agent, and he was telling me, listen, I think if you stop saying a word and don't talk about this ever again, people are going to forget about this. But if you keep talking about these issues, then you're not going to get another contract. And that is my agent said that to me. I was like, I told him this is bigger than basketball. This is bigger than NBA. And this is bigger than myself. And people over there are, getting tortured and raped every day. How can you guys want me to stay silent? And what frustrated me was, like people in NBA, my teammates, the coaches, and everyone, they were talking about all kind of problems that are happening in America and all over the world. Well, when it comes to China, obviously just because of there's so much money and business involved, they were remaining silent. I remember 2 years ago when Houston Rockets GM actually tweet something about Hong Kong. It was the NBA was just very alarmed, and actually Celtics, not many people know this, but made me media unavailable for 2 weeks, just because they didn't want me to say anything, and they knew I could care less. I was just gonna go out there and say something. But I think one thing we need to do is just go out there and try to bring as many awareness we can, and also I hope that my goal is that the more of my colleagues, not just athletes, but celebrities, actors, singers, or rappers, or whoever, to join me and call out all this, human rights abuse happening in China. It's going to happen, I believe it, but it's going to just happen slowly. So I'm just hoping that it's going to happen sooner, I hope. So.
It's going to happen. You're going to be, each one of us is going to be the reason. As each person finishes speaking, make your going to happen. I mean, you can see if we just
For sure.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator, and thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Ennis, and my colleagues around this table. My name is Samuel Chu. I'm the president of the Campaign for Hong Kong. My story is also a little bit different than yours, Ennis. On July 30th, 2020, I fell asleep watching the reruns of Law and Order, and the next morning, I woke up a wanted fugitive. The Hong Kong authorities had issued an arrest warrant for me, along with 5 others who dared to promote democracy and human rights for the city of Hong Kong. The charges were inciting secession and, quote unquote, colluding with foreign powers. I think this is what they're referring to. They're newly minted crimes under the national security law, imposed just a month earlier by the Chinese Communist Party. Both of those crimes are punishable by up to life in prison. It doesn't matter that I've been an American citizen for 25 years. I've apparently violated Article 38 of the law, and this is what it says, that this national security law shall apply to offenses under this law committed against the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region from outside the region by a person who is not a permanent resident of the region. In other words, the draconian law aimed to crush dissent and the freedom of expressions applies to everybody outside of Hong Kong, and no one is beyond its reach. So your next retweet, like what happened to General Manager Daryl Moore, could earn you a prison sentence. Senator, your next vote and your next interview on television could bring sanctions. In fact, just sitting around this table with me today probably makes you a wanted fugitive. You're welcome, by the way. Transnational regression is not an abstract idea. It has real life and human consequences and costs. And it takes away and threatens the collective freedom that all of us enjoy here as Americans. I can no longer travel to Hong Kong. I miss the food, honestly, or any countries that has an active extradition treaties with Hong Kong or China without risking extraditions or arrests. In fact, right now, Hong Kong is finalizing its extradition treaty with Russia. I can't speak to my elderly parents, my families, my friends and loved ones in Hong Kong without subjecting them potentially to investigation and harassment by the police. I think Ennis' story is a prime example. For standing up for Uyghurs and the people of Tibet, he was left without a team.
All 30.
And you can't tell me that the Lakers or the Nets can't use someone who just averaged a double-double last season, who I consider one of the best offensive rebounders in the league history. But here he is. HSBC, a British multinational investment bank, at the behest of the Hong Kong government, shut down and froze Hong Kong media companies and civil society groups' banks' accounts. And then they begin to place restrictions on bank accounts of American citizens at HSBC branches located in the US. When questioned for their conduct in a bipartisan letter last month, their reply in their 4-page letter was basically, it's just the cost of doing business. Just 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice unsealed complaint against 5 individuals right here in the US, charged with stalking, harassing, and spying on US citizens on behalf of the PRC secret police. The charges that was unsealed made tangible and explicit how embedded and far-reaching the transnational repressive tactics are from the PRC. From outright physical violence against US citizens to burning anti-CCP artwork and sculpture displayed in public, to manufacturing a scandal to interfere in a federal congressional election campaign, to bribing IRS officials for alleged dirt on dissidents who are US citizens. I might have been the first US citizen and foreign citizen to be wanted under the NSL, the National Security Law, but I certainly would not be the last. And here is the reality, that a threat to human rights in the Uyghur homeland, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and in anywhere in mainland is a threat to freedom and human rights here in the US. A threat to human rights in Hong Kong is a threat to human rights everywhere. I look forward to the conversation with all of you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Senator Scott, for having me. My name is Simon Zhang. I'm an architect in New York, and I'm a Falun Gong practitioner. Please allow me to share with you a case of persecution. My mom, Ji Yunzhi, a Falun Gong practitioner, died 9 days ago due to the persecution. She narrowly escaped death in forced labor camps in 2001 and 2008, but this time they killed her. During her 49 days of suffering this round, she was in detention center for 11 days. She went on a hunger strike to protest, and they responded with torture, forced feeding, and humiliation. She lost consciousness and was sent to hospital and detained there for her last 39 days, handcuffed to her bed. There were iron fetters on her ankles and a rubber tube in her nose. Police watched her closely around the clock, and she came around a few days after she was sent to hospital, but we don't know what happened after that. On March 20th, the police told my father that she was in the ICU. He went there only told by the doctor that there was no hope. He asked to bring my mom home, but the police said no. The next day, the police notified him that my mom had died. Currently, my father is demanding an explanation from the police. We wait for updates from him daily. My mother is just one of the confirmed deaths of 4,697 Falun Gong practitioners during the ongoing persecution. She was one of the millions of practitioners sent to forced labor camps or who've been tortured and abused. What's worse is that the Communist regime has been harvesting practitioners' organs during the persecution. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual practice with meditative exercises and teachings of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Since 1999, Falun Gong has been persecuted by the Communist regime of China. Falun Gong is one of the victims of religious persecutions in Communist China. There are also Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, and many others who all suffer under the Communist regime. Defending human rights should be a priority for the United States as a matter of national security. Just for instance, because of appalling human rights conditions in China, the Communist Party was able to quickly accumulate wealth after opening its economy in the 1980s. China's cheap imports were a result of labor repression and later slave labor. In my mom's first two terms in the forced labor camp, she was forced to make products for export. Now the Communist Party is exporting its authoritarian ideology through propaganda and tech. We need both Americans and the Chinese people to know what Chinese Communist regime does to its own people. For example, if everyone in China knew about organ harvesting, the party's own legitimacy would be brought into question. If American people knew about organ harvesting, they will demand their representatives to take actions. I hope that Congress will devote more resources to that issue. The best method we have to resist the party's oppression is the truth. The more truth people know, the more actions we take. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Yes, Simon, very, very sorry for your very near loss. When asked questions about China, in some ways it's hard to be brief because China is unlike any challenge the United States has ever faced in its current form. We struggle with trying to identify who and what the threat are because they hide behind things in our culture that we hold sacred. They hide behind ethnicity when the Communist Party of China is not in fact an ethnicity. Even China itself is not an ethnicity. It is a family of many different cultures and civilizations over many years. But the People's Republic of China is only a few decades old. And when it was established, it was conspicuously named New China because it rejected all of old China until the communist part failed. And conveniently, they wanted to use the glory of the past to shield from their own sins. When we try to think about the nature of the challenge that China presents to us today, we often think of it in foreign policy terms. But another thing that makes it very different is it's not just a foreign policy problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a financial problem. It's a civilizational problem. In many ways, the challenge has become so pronounced because they use the institutions that should liberate people and have turned them into tools of oppression. If you think about what the internet was at its advent and now how it's used, it is not about freedom of speech and innovation. It's about surveillance and control. When you think about markets and investment funds, things that were meant to be creative, not just destruction and creative destruction, they focus now on those as vehicles for co-optation and how to channel things to their advantage. They do this very, very well. You just think of the experiences that we've had in recent times. There are two that I'll highlight to try to be brief. You look at the lessons that should be taken, I think, from the Russia-Ukraine situation, where we had a nation that gave up the world's most dangerous weapons in exchange for an internationally reinforced promise for sovereignty, territorial integrity. What happens when those commitments are not honored? Well, it makes it so that those that want to stand for their own freedom against a nearby aggressor don't have the confidence to make those commitments to play by the rules, and instead they stand vulnerable. The most conspicuous thing for an East Asian ally in looking at the situation in Ukraine is how NATO didn't really come up with deterrence until after the Ukrainian people were being bombed. And so the failure of deterrence in Europe will have consequences in Asia, and we have to think about what does that mean about how to treat the People's Republic of China. If you're the island of Taiwan, and you look at that, conspicuously NATO and the United States said, we'll stand behind this proverbial splatter curtain, and we're going to stand firm for all NATO allies. And we say we stand with the Ukrainian people, but Ukraine is not a NATO ally. And so did we provide the defense articles we should have to allow them to have independent defense capability? If you are Taiwan and you are not treated by most around the world as even being a country, and certainly not part of a formal alliance, you have even less to rely upon by way of commitments for your own livelihoods. Key difference, though, is the world will notice much more the loss of a Taiwan than they would a loss of Ukraine. Even though the Ukrainian people are beautiful and they're standing up and they don't deserve what is happening to them, they don't control a massive proportion of the semiconductors and other chips that make smart life go in our modern world. And so all of the comforts that people have availed themselves of to ignore the structural challenges and human rights abuses within China come to the fore, I think, in the thought that came out of Russia-Ukraine when people began to say, is Taiwan next? Deterrence in East Asia is a very different calculus. I think in the Q&A we'll have some time to address it. But I would just emphasize the importance of these institutions and the lesson of Hong Kong as a primer for how the CCP does this to its own people, to the Hong Kong people, how it will try to do it to the Taiwan people, how they do it here in the United States. If you look at what happened with rule of law in Hong Kong, you end up with what were world-class courts now being used to imprison indefinitely our friend Jimmy Lai, who was the founder of the freest media outlet in the Chinese language world. And we look at, as I mentioned, tools of surveillance as opposed to liberation and freedom. The law enforcement in Hong Kong had a pristine reputation by international standards before the handover, and now has become an instrument of complete political control in this regard. And so it's the degradation of institutions where the CCP is very good at getting people to do this to themselves in their own countries. And so when we see athletes, stars, leaders in our own system speak softly, that is the first early warning of the worm working within the soil within. And I think when we at the America First Policy Institute are looking at this challenge, while we want to support those who struggle for freedom abroad, we also must focus on what do we do first in America to make sure that we are insulated against this erosion of these key institutions. Because an America who protects these institutions will have better options for helping others who are struggling against these challenges in their own geographies. When I think of the takeaways of the Ukraine experience, look at dependency, supply chains. Look at independent military and self-defense capability. And if we as Americans don't want to play 911 for the rest of the world, shouldn't we allow our allies and partners to have greater capabilities to defend themselves? And wouldn't independently capable allies and partners be much more complicating for Beijing when it thinks about how to move, to revise boundaries and undermine norms in the region? As I said, this is a topic that's probably too big for us to have a brief conversation, so I'll try to end it here, sir, but I thank you very much for convening the conversation. It has been conspicuous in recent years, while many of us believe that the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party leadership demonstrates a different kind of threat and the most significant national security challenge to the United States, there are so few hearings on this subject that will dive into this. So this conversation is a lifesaver, and we thank you for holding it.
Thanks. I have a number of affiliations. I should emphasize that I'm speaking for myself, not for them, not because they are pro-China and they don't want to talk, but because I'm going to get into specifics that they don't want to be associated with. I work on economics. My concerns now, as the senator has asked for, are supply chains and outbound investment. Supply chains, Steve just mentioned, is a practical concern. I'll give you probably the most important illustration. Drugs end up on our shelves, and we know that some of our drugs come from overseas, including from China. And we back up to active pharmaceutical ingredients, and we split up who supplies active pharmaceutical ingredients to the United States. But that isn't the end of the chain. The chain is fine chemical precursors. That industry is dominated by the Chinese. The Indian suppliers to the US of active pharmaceutical ingredients are reliant on China. And so when you stop at a stage in a supply chain, you don't understand the extent of the reliance you may have on another country. And I think everybody here, but certainly the senator knows really well, there would be an outcry if drugs started disappearing from American shelves. And that is a risk that we face if we don't do something about the full supply chain. Other examples have to do with lithium. I don't think lithium is nearly as important as fine chemicals, but some people do, in particular a number of Chinese companies who are buying lithium deposits this year very intensively. So if we decide that lithium is important, or we decide 5 years from now that lithium is important, we may face a supply chain that is controlled by China. That's the practical side. On the moral side, which has been touched on very eloquently by other people on the panel, from 2016 to 2020, the U.S. increased its stock of portfolio investment in China by $780 billion. Anyone who says we're in a competition with the Chinese or that we were in a trade war, please enter in a competition and a trade war with me, because I would love to receive that kind of investment while you're competing with me or you're my rival. Our financial firms voted with their feet, and they voted to say we're not in any sort of competition with China because we gave them an additional $780 billion in 4 years. That's a moral issue to me. It's obviously a practical issue as well, but the number one issue is moral. We should not be supporting this kind of government with American money to anything like that volume, and preferably with nothing at all. I want to illustrate these points by using a live issue on the Hill, which is whether we should support American production of semiconductors in the United States. And I'm not going to talk about the fundamental issue, which is whether taxpayer money should go to semiconductors. I'm going to talk about, well, if taxpayer money goes to semiconductors, how are we keeping this from helping China? When you make a chip in the US, where do you get the inputs for the chip from? When you are done with a chip and you send it out for assembly, testing, and packaging, that part of the supply chain is dominated by the Chinese. Are we going to give money to American firms to make chips here, and then the chips get sent to China? That's not what I want taxpayer money used for. Similarly on outbound investment, if you're receiving subsidies to produce in the United States, are you going to simultaneously increase your investment to produce in China? Also should not be allowed. So, there's a big debate here, and I'm only addressing part of it. But it would be good if chip subsidies and other actions, such as supporting research in the United States, which I think is a good idea, are restricted so that they don't end up benefiting China. That's step one in our contest. Don't benefit the Chinese with our own actions. We're doing that with outbound investment. We have been. We may do it with the CHIPS Act if proper restrictions aren't there. Step two, I would say, is we need to identify a set of supply chains that we think is important. The Congress needs to do that so that it's binding. Nothing against the Biden administration, but an executive order lapses when you leave. It needs to be part of American law. So the Congress needs to identify a set of supply chains and say China cannot participate at all. Not it can't participate at the end, the visible part that we see. It cannot participate at all. And it cannot be done through incentives. It has to be done through a ban. Because any subsidy we pass here on the Hill, Senator Scott would probably vote against it, but if we passed it anyway, the Chinese would out-subsidize us. They're better at subsidies, they're faster. We can't do it that way. So, there are problems with outbound investment and supply chains. My solutions are, if you want to cooperate with the federal government, you don't get to freely invest in China. And then going a step beyond that, we need to identify what is most important to us in terms of supply chains and ban China's participation entirely.
All right, thank you. It's an honor to be here today among heroes and good friends, Ambassador Curie, Commissioner Scissors. My name is Nizak Nakoktar. As Derek Scissors just said, I'm also representing my own views, but I want to kind of put all of this, at least my testimony, into context. I came here when I was 6.5 years old as an immigrant from Iran. I witnessed the revolution in Iran. I witnessed when freedom, what we had as freedom, was ripped away from under us. My mom took longer to come home from work because she had to take side streets because the guards, the Revolutionary Guards, were stopping cars with women and taking them to the side and raping them. When I came to America, there was 1994, I believe, it was the Iran-US soccer match. My father asked me who I wanted to win. And then he told me, you always root for America because America gave you your education, your home, and your freedom. We cannot take our freedom for granted. People who were born with freedom, have lived through today with freedom, don't understand how fragile it can be. We cannot take our freedom for granted. Okay, by background, I'm a trade and national security lawyer as well as an economist. I'm also a former law professor. 20 years ago, I helped set up the China Non-Market Economy Office at the Commerce Department, where we were at the front lines dealing with China's predatory economic practices to hollow out US industries. I audited countless Chinese companies. More recently, I served as Assistant Secretary at the Commerce Department, working to strengthen US industries and the economic war against foreign adversaries, and also served as the CFIUS lead. I also served performing the duties of the Undersecretary for the Bureau of Industry and Security, dealing with export controls on dual-use items. It is from all of these vantage points that I can tell you, from 20 years on the front lines of this economic battle, that we are losing and we need to do much more. Fundamentally, we are fighting defensively rather than both offensively and defensively. Defensively, we're fighting a losing battle because we cannot keep up with the myriad ways in which the CCP is encroaching into our economy in predatory ways. And our laws are not comprehensive enough to address these challenges. Cybersecurity is a perfect example. Chinese overcapacity is a perfect example. We've had steel, we've had aluminum. Semiconductors is the next frontier. Preform, that's the input into optical fiber cables, the infrastructure of telecom, the infrastructure for 5G. China is running overcapacity there to wipe out competitors. If you control the optical fiber cables, you control telecommunications. We have lack of regulations on outbound investments. When I was in the government, our economic analysis showed that in the US, we invest over $2.3 trillion in Chinese and Hong Kong domiciled companies. Almost $49 billion were invested in the Commerce Department entity list companies, the blacklist of companies. State-owned enterprises, over $152 billion invested in those. Artificial intelligence companies, companies that are geared towards enforcing or monitoring oppressive practices in Xinjiang and throughout China, over $221 billion in those companies. We're not regulating, and I should also say that by investing in China, these traders, the financial markets, aren't recognizing or are hiding the fact that the market in China is not run on fundamentals. It is a casino where the house always wins. We invest every dollar in there, we are bound to lose. We are also not regulating exports of critical technologies to adversaries. We have not yet controlled emerging and foundational technologies. Those technologies are flowing freely to China and to other adversaries. And let me give you an example. By not controlling emerging and foundational technologies, our emerging technologies controls have the same exact control as this table. Our most critical emerging technologies. That needs to change. Now, our laws are riddled with loopholes. We have inadequate enforcement that we need to correct. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a perfect example. Everybody needs to be on the lookout of how this is enforced, and it needs to be aggressively enforced. One of the ways you can quickly do this, when we were in the government, we created lists, entity lists, of companies that were involved in forced labor. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act provides legal authority to sanction those companies. Easy place to look. We've already produced the list. Let's sanction those companies. US companies are going to do what's legal. Tech transfer financial investments. It's incumbent on the US government to impose red lines that companies cannot cross and enforce those. Ultimately, the strategy we need to pursue must be three-pronged. Identify the tools that we have now to fight back against the hollowing out of our industries and use them effectively, not sparingly. Identify where new tools are needed and we make sure that we are implementing them, and rebuild the industries that we need. I want to stress the hollowing out of our industries. China's goal is not to decouple from us, it's for us to trade with them, but for us to be a vassal state. And by systematically hollowing out the industries that are critical to national security, we become more and more economic dependent on them, and then our ability to take action on them is weakened because of the economic interests. Let me be clear, nobody's talking about being free trade or protectionist. We should just be clear that we are not going to trade with adversaries that don't play by the same rules. We will trade freely with the rest of the world. But the last thing I wanted to stress is that we need to do this, and I really appreciate the discussion that we're having today because time is not on our side. So I appreciate your interest, Senator, in moving these priorities to the forefront because we need to do more and we need to do more quickly. Thank you.
I too echo my thanks for hosting the conversation so publicly in the roundtable, and to the ambassador and to everybody, all of my colleagues here, Simon especially. I'm struck by the similarities, regardless of what theme we're touching on that you've asked us to today, of what the trend lines are. 20 years of declining trends that Nazak talked about. I see the same thing in our conventional forces deterrence, our military capabilities, putting aside nuclear for the moment. Hollowing out is a term I use all of the time. That's frankly happening in pockets, again, of our conventional military posture, forces, presence, capability, just across the spectrum. And it's happening relative to trend lines that are moving all in the other direction regarding Beijing. So job one, I think, I don't want to overtake lessons from Ukraine, but of course there are plenty that are applicable. And I would summarize it as two. How ready was Ukraine to defend itself, and apply that, the same question to Taiwan and what we have done, and you've been a great supporter of that. And then where there are gaps, are we providing combat credible forces and answers to those gaps? And there's so much more that can be done in both of those. And I appreciate that you don't want us to just wax poetic and admire the problem. You're looking for a list of solutions, which I support, although I would be happy to talk about this extent of the problem. The erosion of our conventional deterrence in the Asia-Pacific region, it's not McKenzie's opinion. These are our senior military commanders in the region saying that that's the #1 challenge confronting the U.S. military. And they talk about it with an urgency that I think the Defense Department, those sort of on the front line, so to speak, in the region talk about it differently than Washington military leaders, right? And so we call it the Davidson window, the 6-year window, that senior leaders believe that we are inside, we're now a year and a half essentially inside that window where we expect Beijing to take action, forcible action against Taiwan. And in Washington, if you just even look at the president's budget that dropped just yesterday, it's as if, to borrow from Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, we have nothing but time to solve these problems. The solutions are always in the future. Research and development it's important to maintaining an advantage, but until it's fielded and in the hands of, that capability is in the hands of a warfighter, it's not helpful to the here and the now. And what else is in that same budget request? We give away the here and the now. We're going to build 9 ships, but retire 24 out of the United States Navy. The Navy has a record 124 ships forward around the globe. One ship can only be in one place at one time. So when you give that ship away permanently, now you lose the ability to be in that one place at that one time. I was struck by the People's Liberation Army Navy. From 2005 to 2021, they built 132, or added to their fleet, 132 new ships. We added just 5. Now, we didn't build 5, but relative to our number of retirements, compared to what we're building, that's the trend line that we're on, just in one pocket. And of course, their Army, their Navy, their Coast Guard, their maritime militia, and their sub-strategic rocket force are all larger than ours, and in some cases, more capable. Quantity matters. Mass, attrition, volume, these things matter, but depending on given up, on keeping up on a 1-for-1, which I find frightening, because we can certainly choose to do that if we wanted to, in industrial policy and in many other ways. But back to helping Taiwan defend itself better and providing combat credible forces. So we've also learned more lethal aid sooner and in greater quantities. These are ways that, of course, we can help. Being there, being forward. I just talked about how the Navy is going to shrink under this administration's plans significantly in the next 12 months if they have their way. So that exacerbates our say-do gap. If you look at the military's pre-positioned stocks in Europe, okay, when the Defense Department surged, well, the Army specifically, more than 10,000, they already had 30,000 troops on the continent, but they surged 10,000, since the rattling of an invasion until today. And basically what you saw was an infantry division out of Georgia be able to fly to Europe, fall in on their equipment sets, and basically fire at the range within a week. And they only were able to do that because Congress has been pushing the Defense Department to modernize, update, and then rehearse with their pre-positioned stocks. So basically that's just full units of equipment. So it's everything from beans to bullets, but it's tanks, it's armored vehicles, it's munitions and weapons. You got to take it out. You got to make sure the batteries still work and the parts aren't missing and the things aren't broken. Then you got to drive the vehicles. You got to make sure that they can operate on the, heavy vehicles can move on certain roads to get where they need to go. And the Army had been doing all this. Well, those kinds of similar activities across the services have to happen in Asia. And it's a long lead challenge. If you want that ability in even just say 3 years from now, you have to start talking to people, negotiating contracts, putting shovels into the ground, building warehouses, then putting stuff in there. And these are the kinds of, again, concrete steps that you can take that matter, and that if we don't do it, that we would be remiss in this now shrinking window. And lastly is, of course, foreign military financing. Not my core area, but it certainly helps where Taiwan can buy US-made equipment more easily, grants and loans. Just 2% of the State Department's budget for FMF this year is for Asia specifically. And I know there's a variety of reasons for that. I don't want to get into all the politics of it, but that's certainly something that your leadership is welcome on. Thanks again.
Thank you, Senator Scott, for the opportunity to be here today and for convening this important discussion. My name is Jacob Hellberg. I'm a senior advisor at the Stanford University Center on Geopolitics and Technology and an adjunct fellow at CSIS. More relevant to this conversation, I'm the grandson of 2 Holocaust survivors that were among the fortunate few at Auschwitz, still alive in time to be liberated by the Allied forces and saved from extermination. I always believed their story and those of the forces that fought to liberate them were real-life examples of what makes America exceptional. A place where 2 teenage Polish immigrants that don't speak the language can live, toil, and dream and slowly spring back a joyful life from the ashes of genocide. I once asked them how they survived the unspeakable horrors of mass extermination and dehumanization without succumbing to an implacable, permanent sense of rage. They were too grateful to be bitter, they said. They were grateful to the nation that took them in when no one else wanted them and gave them a second chance at life, and they were too hopeful that the world would learn, never again. I share my grandparents' unshakable gratitude to the nation that gave us refuge and extraordinary opportunities, but I'm disheartened that the world has not learned. The toxic mix of the Chinese Communist Party's genocidal practices against Uyghurs and its pursuit of global political and economic dominance risks clawing the world back into the very darkness my grandparents escaped 77 years ago. Technology is the foundation of China's authoritarian systems. Much has been written about China's technological efforts, ranging from e-payments to new mobility, social scoring, artificial intelligence, and computer networking. Mr. Senator, most of these efforts converge over a single high-level objective: to de-anonymize the internet and empower the Chinese Communist Party with the capacity to see all things in all places at all time. The power of all-encompassing omnipresence that China is building is a capability past authoritarians could only dream of. The CCP is actively working to export this capability abroad and over time envelop other countries behind the Great Firewall. China is using 21st century technologies to recreate 20th century style spheres of influence. The Chinese Communist Party is in a Cold War with the American-led order, and I'm encouraged to see American policymakers are beginning to accept this reality as a basis for policy planning. Our country has never faced an adversary as formidable as the Chinese Communist Party. The magnitude of the threat cannot be understated. America cannot afford the luxury of time and passivity. Policymakers should urgently consider taking historic steps to course-correct past miscalculations and defend the American way of life we all want for our children in the decades ahead. In that vein, I'd like to offer a few steps the Congress can take, which I'd be happy to discuss in greater detail in the Q&A. First, Congress should recalibrate America's trade relationship with its foremost geopolitical adversary. Congress can jumpstart this effort in 4 steps. Restrict outbound capital flows to China by legislating a framework analogous to an outbound CFIUS framework. Second, end China's most favored nation status under American law. Third, protect Americans from foreign espionage by legislating a framework to suspend Chinese software applications in the United States, such as TikTok. Several executive orders passed by the last administration and the current one offer a detailed list of risk criteria, which can be used to be transposed into law as the basis for such a new framework. Fourth, deter U.S. companies from investing in China by increasing scrutiny over China-related Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. The Congress and various committees can subpoena companies, the internal communications of companies, to investigate potential violations of that nature. A second line of effort might include Congress taking steps to unleashing significantly more private capital and entrepreneurship aimed at addressing the country's most pressing national security challenges. Congress can do this by establishing a new DoD venture and procurement fund that allows the Department of Defense to procure and leverage new cutting-edge technologies independent of continuing resolutions, or CRs, that stifle the department's ability to enlist new technologies for years at a time. As McKinsey said time is of the essence. Third, and lastly, Congress can help reinvigorate the credibility of allied deterrence in the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters by decentralizing deterrence capabilities across key nodes of America's alliance networks. In the near term, this might entail helping key allies in frontline democracies with A, substantially increased conventional lethal aid, as my previous colleagues alluded to, and second, unconventional forms of aid, such as technical training to equip them with more asymmetric capabilities, such as advanced cyber and hacking capabilities. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thanks, everybody. If we can get, yeah, there we go. You know, if everybody in the country would talk about what you guys talk about, I mean, it would completely change overnight. They would see the human rights violations, understand that China really is trying to control us, then we'd all change. So, Simon Samuel and us, why don't we start by why is Communist China, why is the party threatened by Christians, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and other religious minorities? If you guys would just talk about that first, and we'd all weigh in.
Thanks. My personal understanding is that basically all religions are teaching you to think independently. You have to build your own system judging what is good, what is bad. And people are mingled together, are interacting with each other, exchanging thoughts in religions. So it forms community. These are things that the communist regime does not want at all. They want you to follow whatever they say, even if day one they say things differently from day two. And they want you to follow exactly what they want you to do. But if you build your own judgment system, you are not going to follow them naturally. So they feel threatened. That is the reason, I think, why the communist regime persecute religions like Falun Gong or Christians or Buddhists. In China, at least from 70 years ago, from 1950s, they built committees in the government guiding Christians or Buddhists to swear to the party's flag or the five-star flag, saying that whatever you believe, there is a higher power, which is the Communist Party. So it sounds ridiculous, but it's happening everywhere in China. Like Christians, if you see Christian churches are pushed down, it's because they think the God or the Jesus Christ is higher than Communist regime, than their church is down. And there are millions of Chinese Falun Gong practitioners that think truthfulness, compassion, forbearance should be the judgment standard of the every daily life, of their daily life, and then they become a target.
Samuel, would anything or Dennis?
I'll just add, I think, to the point that I think Steve made a point earlier about the use of different kind of institutions and tools. Religion, I think, for the Communist Party is an important part of the apparatus for control. I think that and I think what is happening now in Hong Kong is similar to what I think Simon just described. Just recently, I was speaking to a Catholic priest who was sharing with me the stories of how that they have now begun to invite, quote unquote, Catholic priests in Hong Kong to go up to the mainland for meetings. I think that is a sign of the fact that they see religion as being a key part of the way that they maintain control. And that instead of just, I think, using it as a way of allowing the party to maintain their people's allegiance down to the very grassroots level. I think that's part of what I think is driving beyond, I think, what Simon has described about the danger of ideology, of the idea of people having something, allegiance and loyalty and beliefs beyond the Communist Party.
Sammy, why don't you start? Do you think that, and see whatever anyone else thinks on Hong Kong, do you think there's any chance that the Hong Kong citizens are going to have any power to be able to stop this?
I think it's remarkable if you think about how quickly one of the freest cities in the world became one of the most repressed, almost overnight. And the collapse has been total. I think the control has been complete. What I do think is on the side of Hong Kongers and people like me who some would accuse being too optimistic is that it is rarely seen in history that a city, a region, or any kind of municipalities that have enjoyed the freedom of everything that we talked about here, of free trade, of human rights, of internet freedoms, and press freedom and the freedom of expression, have it take away after they have lived and breathed that for decades. And what I think is standing on the side of the Hong Kong people, as I said, is kind of like telling your kids that, after they watch TV, that TV doesn't exist. Good luck with that. And I think what remains are the people, the talent, the institution, and the institutional history of what decades of protests, of fighting for democratic rights. I think that's an important resource. That's, I think, an unmatched resource that exists not just in Hong Kong, but in Tibet, and the people of the Uyghur people. I think that, and the ambassador, I think I would be curious in your take on this as well, is that freedom is not exclusive to anybody. Everyone deserves and have a claim to freedom, meaning that it's not just the Hong Kongers, it's not just the Tibetans, it's not just the women, it's not just the workers, it's not just the children. And I think that we have to take this broader view of that, Hong Kong people alone cannot defeat repression. But that I think it requires all of us and connecting the dots in those ways to get there.
I think there are some words that Samuel had hit on that are absolutely bullseye on this. One is the objective they have is control. And when you have any institution other than the party or the state that has the ability to independently identify truth, virtue, morality, success, then they don't have control. And so we've lived through elements of this in the last couple of years where we've had people tell us what the truth is about a virus, and it turns out not to be true. But we were not allowed to question it. That is what the CCP does. It is what it has done in Hong Kong. But if you have a religious faith and you have an independent channel to find meaning in your life, to define truth and morality, to be able to question the actions of yourself or others by means other than what the state tells you, by definition, they have lost control. And so from the Cultural Revolution forward, the Communist Party of China has had only two means for staying in power. One was the juice of economic activity, and the other was absolute willingness to use power to impose its control. And that is, I think, why we see the human rights abuses most uniquely in China now.
And I actually want to put an added spin on control over our corporations, control over our corporations have become mouthpieces for the CCP. That's because they're so economically dependent on revenues there. The CCP doesn't have to be its own lobbyist, our corporations are. And so in this context of control, I think it's really important for all of us to remember the economic control that the CCP currently has over the corporations into the United States. Certainly, and as his experience, he's experienced this firsthand, the corporations in our allied nations. And at what point are we willing to rip the Band-Aid? And another point I really want to make, because just as a trade practitioner, I've seen this for a long time. Companies talk about economic cost. Oh, it's going to be painful. It's going to be painful. 2 points. One, the world has to go through growing pains, and you don't go through growing pains without some type of pain. Second is, just as an anecdotal example, we have over 250 anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases against China. Those tariffs are imposed on imports to prevent harm to industry. The bottom has not fallen out of the U.S. economy by virtue of those tariff restrictions. Certainly, we've witnessed the 301s. So my point is, we've had decades of experience demonstrating that imposing costs actually improves U.S. economic resilience rather than destroys it. So let's not fall into that trap.
What price do y'all think that the Communist Party of China is paying for its human rights violations, either internally or externally? Do you think they're suffering enough?
No country can escape the damage that they do to their people through repression like this. The long tail of it has not yet been seen, and I think that, if you see what happens to trust in this society. China has become a very low trust society. It's become a very, a place where you don't trust strangers, you don't help strangers. You see every once in a while videos coming out of China of people walking past on the sidewalk, someone who's been run over by a cart, or things that just appalling things happen, and people lose their sense of humanity because of the system that they're subjected to. And this does have consequences for a society. It can't not. I think we've all seen also in our own society the consequences of discrimination, of racism, of how it harms and damages a society. That is true in China as well. The Chinese Communist Party has enforced a legal regime and regulatory regime that is deeply discriminatory and deeply racist, and dehumanizes the ethnic minorities in the country that are not the non-Han, ethnic minorities. And this will have costs for the soul of the country. It's rotting it out from within. But are they paying an economic cost? Not really, not sufficiently, certainly. I think that we are moving in that direction. You're starting to see questions, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, about what's it going to take for us to start to really see China in the same light that investment in Russia, investment in China what's it going to take? I think the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that Nazak mentioned and that I mentioned also is going to be a really important case study, as she said. What cost are we willing to pay to get forced labor out of our solar supply chain, for instance, and out of other supply chains in this country? And it's documented fact. We know that forced labor is taking place in these areas. We know which industries have the biggest problems, solar being at the base level. It's in the polysilicon. You cannot get away from it. And what are we going to do about it now? We know. We can't say we don't know. That was an excuse at one point, but it's no longer one. So I think that we're going to have to pay for ignoring this. We're going to have to pay a cost for ignoring these abuses ourselves for the past 20, 30 years. But those costs will come due at some point.
One point that I'd like to add is on the previous topic, the CCP's behavior over the last few years shows it has no tolerance for any alternative sources of power domestically, and those patterns of behavior have increasingly been reflected in their interactions with countries abroad. We remember in the early days of the pandemic, members of the CCP lashing out at European parliamentarians simply because of a report on Chinese disinformation in the early days of the pandemic, and which triggered in China sanctions against several EU parliamentarians. On the topic of costs, all roads lead back to our financial entanglement in China. And at the end of the day, if we address that, it's half the battle. China has been working tirelessly to decouple themselves from us. And so I think we have a lot to worry about if no one wants a race to the bottom, but at the end of the day, if we don't work to decouple ourselves from them, we could find ourselves sitting in this room in a few years talking about how we're not coupled, it's simply a one-way dependency where they're decoupled from us while we're still reliant on them. And the last point that I would add is, obviously, millions of people across this country have experienced shell shock during the financial crash, and which was an incredibly traumatic experience. There is a very large, under-discussed challenge at work with respect to the hundreds of billions of dollars of American assets that have been locked up in China over the last 2 decades, which could potentially be at risk if the political relationship between the US and China got significantly rockier. The way that the potential impact that this could have on American retirement accounts, on pension funds, on so many parts of the American economy that rely on the assumption that those assets are liquid and will be able to someday be repatriated back to the US. If China decides to cut off Apple from its supply chains, we have a $2 to $3 trillion market cap company in which millions of Americans are invested directly and indirectly that could potentially be held at gunpoint, which could have significant macroeconomic impacts on the economy as a whole. And that's just one company. That's before you get to the $1 billion, $500 million, $3 billion funds that have invested money in different parts of the American financial system in China.
So let's move to we've all seen what's happened in Russia, right? American companies have decided, many, not to do business there. American consumers have decided not to buy their products. So Steve, why don't we talk about what do you envision what we should be doing before Communist China invades Taiwan, and how we're going to make sure we can do the same sanctions and American companies will be able to walk away just like they're doing in Russia?
Well, thank you. I think the first thing that we would need to do is to have a very open and mature conversation between the United States and our friends in Taiwan. If you look at one of the key factors in Europe's somewhat slowness to rise to this occasion in the early stages, you can look immediately at energy independence as an issue. The dependence that was there definitely had an impact on national security and human rights and economic decisions. And if you look at Taiwan, Taiwan is blessed with many, many things that have been a help to us and much of the world, but one thing it's not blessed with is its own energy. For political reasons, they have chosen to move away from nuclear as a key provider of that kind of support. But I think if we look at the risk of World War III, we cannot be frozen in post-World War II thinking about how to address this. And I think that same applies to energy. When people look at the risks of a Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, we now have advances in technology that can make small modular reactors that have much lower risk for the accidents and fallout kinds of problems, and yet a place like Taiwan would be able to run foundries, light up cities, allow food and other essential services to come and go. Communications networks, there's a big push about Elon Musk moving in free internet and communications technology into Ukraine after the conflict had occurred. How much advanced planning and pre-positioning of systems that would be redundant and not easily co-opted or defeated by the CCP. What options do we have to move in that direction before a crisis is upon us? With Ukraine, there were significant questions about those that want or need to flee. It's a lot more complicated to get from an island that is 100 miles off of China, but way more miles away from the United States and even from parts of Japan. We have a unique advantage in East Asia in the sense that Japan is a very capable and reliable ally that also has a deep cultural and historical tie to the people of Taiwan. I think we should be in a position to stop treating Japan as if it's a junior partner and recognize it as a world leader a true responsible stakeholder who might have its own independent interest in being able to support the people of Taiwan, but also add to deterrence of China. China, for too long, has been able to rely upon the American condominium, where they could lobby one town in the entire globe and be able to minimize their risk. If they had to invest all of these resources and deal with all of the wrinkles of independent approaches that come from India, come from Tokyo, and hopefully the Australians coming out of their recent unpleasantness will be of a different mind. We have options. The problem is we have waited so long, and we need our friends in Taiwan to be open-minded about moving in directions that maybe their internal politics might not have led them, but the realities of the threats that I think have been exposed by the Ukraine situation perhaps can open a different conversation. They have significant dependencies on China, always have, but we have to find ways to at least gradually move to safe shoring, if not onshoring, of those capabilities. But it begins with, I think, having a clear, honest conversation and let the democratically elected leaders of Taiwan ask for and respectfully get a hearing for what they say they need. I think the people of Ukraine didn't get that before time came up.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, to those great points. So whether China takes Taiwan militarily or legally, or sort of like what they did with Hong Kong, I think deterrence, I hear the administration talking a lot about, well, after China invades Taiwan, we're going to do this. No. It's about deterrence. And I think, Senator, you hit on a good point. I've been an advocate of letting the Chinese government know that we will sanction their central bank. We will sanction all of their banks if they even think about invading Taiwan, militarily, legally, or whatever. The reason why we shouldn't be afraid of that approach is because if China takes Taiwan and we don't have access to chips, the economic impact to the United States, to our allies, is going to be devastating. It is the collapse of our economies. And so we need to be very strong, very resolute in a credible threat, because the reverse is true, our economic collapse. I wanted to make another point about TSMC. Obviously, we all understand the strategic value of TSMC. TSMC, we rely on TSMC for literally hundreds and thousands of chips and SKUs. Hundreds and thousands of chips and SKUs. We don't have TSMC's IP. TSMC says, well, yeah, I'm going to make these 5 nanometer chips in the United States that we don't even have applications for. Great, but we don't have their IP. So if something happens to Taiwan, we're in a terrible situation in the United States, because China makes a whole bunch of chips, Taiwan makes the most, but we don't really make very many to protect our industries and international security. So I would suggest that folks think about, if we actually do want to put our money where our mouth is to defend Taiwan, Taiwan needs to step up and provide its IP to us, either a licensing basis or whatever, but because if Taiwan goes and we can't defend it, we lose as well because of the lack of IP. Finally, there's a lot, while I'm a huge supporter of rebuilding semiconductor capacity, near shore, onshore, whatever, I think we really need to be realistic about the time horizons. Again, hundreds of SKUs and hundreds and thousands of SKUs over at Taiwan. Realistically, this is going to take decades, trillions of dollars to onshore, near shore, et cetera. So the focus really needs to be on what are the chips that we need for defense capabilities, what our upstream supply chains are, what do we need for our defense sector. Because if we can't supply chips for our defense sectors to defend Taiwan, to defend our allies, to defend our own nation, all hope is lost. And so the near-term defense needs, longer-term economic needs.
Echoing what my colleagues just said, I would break down this question into 2 parts. The first is, why do we care about Taiwan? And the second is, how do we deter a potential intervention in Taiwan? On the question of why we care, there are 2 main issues with respect to Taiwan's strategic place in American strategy. The first is our ability to reliably access a steady supply of chips that Taiwan provides to the U.S. The second is, irrespective of access, the question about integrity. If China invades Taiwan and is able to control critical parts of the semiconductor supply chains, we won't have any ability to ensure that the integrity is being protected and that those chips don't all have backdoors for the CCP at the hardware level into our information networks. If the CCP has a backdoor at the hardware level, it can compromise all the information that runs on top of it, which triggers significant consequences for the protection of intellectual property, the protection of free speech, personal privacy. On the question of, so how do we deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? If we think about, in the technology space, it's often said that information networks that are decentralized are more resilient than information networks that are centralized into a single node. Networks that are centralized are efficient, but much more brittle to attacks and to cyber attacks. Information networks that are decentralized are less efficient, but are far, far more resilient. And if we think about America's alliance networks in similar terms, allowing our allies, decentralizing deterrence across our alliance networks and arming our allies with more lethal capabilities will no doubt make certain aspects of American grand strategy less efficient, but on the whole, it'll make alliance networks far more resilient, and it'll make deterrence far more credible over time. So the debate about how we decentralize deterrence across American alliance networks can also be broken down into two parts. The first is conventional lethal aid, which we're seeing right now play out in real time in Ukraine. And the second is unconventional, which raises broader level questions about debates that have been sacred cows and taboo for many decades, but that we should have because the stakes are very high and we don't have the luxury of time. So I think it would be a healthy thing for the foreign policy community to have the debate about whether having the basic policy of discouraging allies to have their own standalone nuclear deterrent is still the right approach. France developed their nuclear deterrent and the world didn't collapse, and so did the UK and so did Israel. If we look at the Asia Pacific, there are 4 nuclear powers. 3 of them are autocracies and American adversaries, Russia, North Korea, and China, and the 4th is the United States. And no one else in the Pacific has a nuclear deterrent. And so the question is, do we think credibly that stable, wealthy democracies that have incredibly advanced levels of technical expertise would be necessarily irresponsible stewards of a nuclear deterrent capability? It's a worthy debate to have. I can't say that I have a prejudged opinion on that debate, but I do think that it would be healthy to at least have the debate and stress test old orthodoxies that we've had for a very long time. The last point about unconventional deterrence, which I alluded to in my opening remarks, is on cyber capabilities. We see now with Russia's intervention in Ukraine how difficult it is logistically to supply the Ukrainians with conventional lethal aid. Getting weapons into a country that's already under assault is very difficult because there are Russian fighter jets in the air. We want to avoid entering into a direct military conflict, so weapons have to be smuggled across the border through Poland, et cetera, et cetera. Providing frontline democracies like Ukraine or Taiwan or other allies in the region with advanced cyber capabilities alleviates a lot of these logistical complexities and potentially gives them significant capabilities that could have deterrent properties on their own. And in an off-the-record setting, I'd be happy to go into a little bit more detail about what some of those capabilities might be.
So if you believe in deterrence by denial, you don't want to get to that stage, right? You don't want to actively have to then go defend the island. But I want to think about all of the phases and stages, but I want to be credible in convincing Beijing that it just wouldn't be worth the effort. And you do that through dozens of different ways, conventionally through nuclear policy and nuclear modernization, and then all of the other components and facets, I think, that we've talked about today. Right now, I'm not sure that we've really convinced Beijing that it would be too painful to do that for a variety of reasons, some of which I outlined. I do think in planning and in sort of Pentagon think, it would help if Congress pushed the department to think more creatively. So this promise of these future technologies, will come to bear at the moment when, potentially Beijing moves militarily. The war plans are essentially giant missile exchanges and salvos, and it's really uncomfortable, sacred cow, to talk about, well, what happens after the giant munitions exchange? What if we have to take back the island? What if, as Steve was talking about, this is a place where most of the food is imported and all of the energy, essentially. And so what if we're there on a humanitarian basis solely, and then trying to fend off, worsening aggression? There are so many other scenarios that it's just too taboo to talk about, much less plan. But if you don't plan, as I described earlier with the pre-positioning, then it won't work when the moment comes to flip the switch. And so I do think that creativity is something we're lacking. I was encouraged to read, we have Marines on the island training Taiwanese military forces. Great. We need to do that times 100 in other different ways. In some cases, we reveal that capability. In other cases, we hold it in abeyance as a surprise when we need it.
Oh, I think eventually we're going to decouple. The question is, well, all right, there's a race. How long can Xi Jinping stay in power? And that's a whole giant conversation, and I would just be engaging in speculation, but I just want to put it out there that he may not be able to stay in power quite as long as he wants, which is forever. If he's successful in staying in power, the longer he stays, the more likely we are to decouple. He's not going to change his spots. He's not going to say, oh gosh, I don't want to be a cult of personality dictator anymore, or I believe in the market, not the state, or any of the various things you're expecting, that one might hope for. It's not going to happen. He's not going to go quietly into the good night and say, I'd really like to retire to a nice villa. So the longer he stays in power, the odds rise that we're going to decouple. The question is, and it echoes what people have been saying about other issue areas, are we going to prepare ourselves, or are we going to have it thrust upon us? Are we going to suddenly have to decouple because we're in a confrontation with the Chinese that is violent or is about to be violent, and we're forced to do so? Or are we going to get ready? I wouldn't, I think the time horizon for a Taiwan contingency, of which I'm not at all an expert, might be a good time horizon on the economic side too. You have 4 years, 5 years, okay. Well, we can do a lot on the economic side in that time if we're willing. We could start, as I said, by not helping them anymore. That's not a sanction. It's not a cost. It's just we stop helping China and its various economic weaknesses. If we do that, maybe people will say, oh, gosh, that wasn't that bad, and we can move over forward on other issues. But I think, in the happy world, I say this all the time, makes people uncomfortable, Xi Jinping just drops dead. We wouldn't have to necessarily decouple. We'd have to see what the new leadership is. If he's in charge for 10 years, we will be decoupling over those 10 years. And the question is it under our control, or is it forced on us?
I do want to add one point, though. The one item that keeps me up at night is that for our defensive capabilities, we need chips and we need critical minerals. And without those, we have a one-strike capability, which then takes us to a nuclear scenario very, very quickly. So as we're looking at the time horizon, as Derek said, in terms of engaging in self-help, I think China's calculus is it's going to move on Taiwan sooner, certainly before the next administration. That means we don't have much time to solve our critical mineral vulnerabilities, at least very minimum, our chips for defense, because we need those in order to have more than one strike capability.
Well, as a human rights lawyer, I have to be long-term optimistic, right? It's, part of the job. Short-term, I think it is going to be painful across the board, but I am encouraged that we are having these conversations, that these are becoming the norm, that we are talking about these things. So I do think that we are at least, awake and alive to the challenge, whereas 5 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. So I've seen the sea change there, and I've also, as Europe is coming out of their fog on this, we will have better partners going forward, and we'll have more opportunities to work with the kinds of partners that we need to reshore, to onshore, to have free trade among free nations, which should be the goal for us.
Yeah, I am very optimistic. I remember first time I started to talk about these issues, and even my teammates in the locker room were scared to, say a word, or scared to come and talk to me. And then the more I talk about it, and the more we speak in the locker room. And I remember like a few months later, my teammates started to ask a lot of questions. And unfortunately, they were telling me that, we love you, we support you, we just cannot do it out loud. Because we have so many sneaker deals, and we want to get another contract, and we have family to feed and stuff. But even them, started asking me questions was a hope for me. And I mean, this year, I think what WTA did was just unbelievable. I want to mention that because I think every organization and associations should take an example of what they have done. And I think I am hopeful. I think NBA and many other organizations, is going to get there one day, but it's just going to take some time, and it's just going to take some, people to come out like you guys and to educate them. Today I'm here to not speak, but just learn and educate myself, so I can just, educate some of my colleagues and athlete friends around me. So I am very optimistic. Yes.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm optimistic because I trust and believe in what we have witnessed in the response to Ukraine and the war and the aggression from Russia is that I think something that a number of people have mentioned is that if you are clear and transparent and honest about what is happening and what we're willing to do, people will step up. And I think part of it is being able to tell the body politic and Americans, everyday Americans, ordinary Americans, what is happening, and watch them step up and say that we can make these changes and we can sacrifice, our own benefit and safety and risk for the greater good. And I think that that's an important and really I think there's been a lot of talk in the last few days about regime change. What gives me hope is not about policy of regime change, either Russia or China or anywhere. For me, the hope lies in the fundamental rights that people have for self-determination. And I think that's what ultimately we have to. We never know where that spark will come. I continue to encourage everyone to see hope in all dissent and any injustice, and anyone who's willing to speak up here and in Hong Kong and in Taiwan and in Tibet and anywhere else, because that's the right to self-determination will outlast whatever authoritarian control that I think Xi Jinping and the regime will try to hold on to.
Yeah, I'm optimistic too. Since I'm from China, I know China pretty well. So in the grassroots level, Chinese people are changing. So they are no longer like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where the communist regime can easily change or force them to do something. Partially because the world is being together and the globalization of information changed them. And partially because something like this book, The 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party, it inspired over 300 million Chinese people to renounce the communist regime, the Communist Party, and its affiliations. So before the mainstream media or the officials notice, Chinese people are starting to change. And something happening like in Hong Kong is a good example reminding people China Communist Party is not trustful at all. They promised 50 years of no change, and in 20 years they want you to change totally. So Chinese people are changing. And outside of China, a Western world that used to give money to Chinese regime, they are changing. Like conversation like today, it was not happening like 10 years ago. And in Australia, in Japan, those governments and Congress and people are changing too. So the future, I'm optimistic. Thank you.
Dismal science. I'm not optimistic. I wish I could be optimistic. We have a number of industries in this country, as has been referred to, that are very closely tied to CCP decisions, whether they like it or not. The tech industry has long been one. In the past few years, the financial industry has been one. The last few months, you have an avalanche of people saying, now's the time to invest in China because stocks are beaten down. Well, you know, maybe there are other reasons not to invest in China other than price. So I wish I could be optimistic. I would be optimistic if we had, and we need both parties to do this, people who would stand up and say in both parties, this is going to be costly. We're not talking about Belgium here. We cannot address this problem and pay no price. But it has to be both parties or it won't last, and it has to be somebody making the case to people, this is why. It's not going to be that easy and it's not going to be that quick, but there's an overwhelming reason why. If we have that, then I'll be glad to be optimistic.
Well, that gives me hope. So I have mixed feelings. This conversation, all the folks in this room, your leadership, Senator, this is what gives me hope. The fact that we, with our allies in dealing with Russia, came together to together withstand, endure economic harm for the greater good, that gives me hope. The thing that doesn't give me hope is that fundamentally, genuinely, time is not our side, not on our side. All of the legal mechanisms we have in place to deal with the problem are riddled with loopholes. We're still having tech transfer. We're still having a lot of bad things happen. And unless there's a willingness for the backlash by industry to do what's right and endure that backlash to do what's right for the country and move the country forward, I really fear that until we get there, we might be in a losing situation.
I'm with Derek. I will get optimistic when there's leadership in Washington that's bipartisan that tells, because Samuel's right, and the American people will get there. I think they would stand up and say, salute, so to speak, proverbially, to making a sacrifice. But, I go back to my Macbeth reference. There's too much passivity about the urgency of the challenge and confronting it quickly, and I think Beijing knows that. So I hope you can help change that.
Your efforts went through you, right?
Absolutely. So I share the grave concerns that a lot of people here have expressed, and I think that as I mentioned earlier, I agree with everyone here that China poses a threat and is an adversary, the likes of which our country has never seen before, in terms of its size, in terms of the comprehensiveness of its power and its global ambitions. With that being said, and to end on a slightly more optimistic note, I am optimistic about the fact that I think that this contest is more than just who has the biggest population. It's fundamentally also about ideals, and you're kind of seeing a microcosm of that play out in Ukraine, where Ukraine is obviously a third of the size of Russia. And it's about the fact that on the one hand, you have a country here that's a democracy that stands for ideas that are fundamentally universal human aspirations. And on the other hand, you have an authoritarian government that feels the need to surround its government officials with masses of armed men and to try to extinguish any ounce of individual human thought and words of expression. And so whenever you have a leader that boasts himself in front of the world with alongside these grand military parade, but then is terrified of words and thoughts, I think that's a regime that I would short in the long run.
Peter Drucker, I don't know how long ago he said this. Created. So we all can create the future. So it's up to us, and it starts with a spark, like I think Samuel said. So we're going to do it. So thanks everybody for being here. We're going to make good things happen. I'm very optimistic.